and it's the history of the Xbox launch. So there's a fantastic article, and I'd really recommend people read it, by Bloomberg. And it's like a oral history of an American video game empire. Very, very good article. I'm going to butcher her name because I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Is it Dina Bass, you reckon?
I don't know, Dina Bass.
Dina Bass, sorry. And Jason Schreier and Takashi Mochizuki.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I'm just wondering. Anytime you just like pass it over to me.
No, like, you know what I find about Japanese names, and I find them easier to say if you have a Japanese inflection to it. But obviously, I don't want to do that. If that makes sense.
Well, thankfully, like the phonetically Japanese and English are actually very. Like, there's no sounds that exist in one that don't exist in the other, as opposed to something like Mandarin. So it's pretty easy to say.
Yeah, definitely. I actually think it'd be easier if it wasn't like that, because then I could actually try to speak it in the proper way. Yeah. Exactly. I think that's what really trips me up. Anyway, so a friggin' amazing article. Amazing that they're able to get like Bill Gates,
wild. It's wild.
Steve Ballmer. Like, I'm sure they got all the people who started the Xbox, big people, but they actually got like Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer to get interviewed, and then just randomly they'll go, "Oh, here's the like head of Bungie," and it's like, what? And it's actually like just small little bits. So, as the Xbox shill, Swinny, I think you can definitely drive most of this, but I've got a lot of notes as well. But what were some of the highlights that you saw from the article?
Well, first of all, I just want to mention, like people like Allard as well that are so integral, like all throughout this article. There's a lot of like very smaller comments from, as you said, like people like Peter Moore, Howard Lincoln and Nintendo at the time, Todd Howard, like lots of small things that it seems like they've. I don't know how they devised this article because it's crazy, but I'm guessing they, just got general comments to put in, but then they interviewed a lot of people together, it seems like. But this is probably the best article I've ever read about video games, like on a news article.
No, because I'd say it's up there. I'd say it's up there.
The only problem is it wasn't really. I'm not saying this in a bad way. I wouldn't go so far as to call it an article.
Well,
it was a lot of
feature or whatever. Because
it was a lot of effectively quotes.
Well, that's why
people replying or like snippets of conversations as opposed to an actual article.
But I mean, it's still within.
But I love reading it.
So like it's to me probably the best video game article ever composed. However, it was composed because it's just such an awesome insight into one of the. I still think such a strange thing that happened, but made sense. Yeah. Like, you're talking about the video game space was always dominated since the death of the Atari. But it was dominated by Japanese. I was about to say developers, but Japanese companies.
Platform holders,
Yeah, and then for Microsoft to come in. And I remember when I first heard about the Xbox, no joke, I remember exactly where I was.
The Xbox, you mean the Windows Entertainment Platform?
Yes. So we were in high school at the time. I don't know if it was year 9 or year 10, and there was a certain area that we used to sit. So we all went to high school together. For anyone that
was it on the bench with Miss
Papademus
across the?
Are you trying
to dox us,
Mike? Okay,
I'm not going to say what happened, but was it on that bench?
Let's go.
Okay, just wondering.
So I remember, like, I was sitting there, and I think Intergot, you're probably the one that said, "Oh, I just heard that Microsoft has announced a console," and I was like, "That's stupid. Microsoft, they make Windows."
Wow! And look at him now.
Everyone at the time was so cynical about it. It's like, that's ridiculous. That's never going to work. Microsoft.
And can I also say, just to add to that, and I'm not saying Microsoft gets a lot of love these days, but at the late 90s, early 2000s, people hated Microsoft with a passion. Like, people would be like, I'm anti-Microsoft. I hate Microsoft. So for them to go and create a video game console that the whole point of it is you put it in your home, your lounge room, it just seems so contrary to people's sentiment towards the company.
And it wasn't a company that did fun stuff.
Yeah.
Back then.
Yeah.
It wasn't like the fun sort of company. It was the serious, we do, proper software. So it kind of makes sense that people didn't. I do find it funny that now Sony feels like the more serious one in some ways.
So
like just their marketing and everything so much more serious.
Circling back to what you're saying.
Yeah, just to finish off what I was saying. So just to then place that, because, when you think physically where you were and when you heard about something for the first time, they talk about exactly when this stuff happened. So then I could actually picture myself where I was in my life. Cool. It's just wild to think.
I have to say that is really cool, yeah.
And then when they went through, so they talk about that the idea from the Xbox, came from a few different places, but essentially a lot of it was born from an executive retreat. And as a response to what Sony was doing with the PlayStation, and how PlayStation was saying, they essentially wanted to be in every home and almost replace PCs, which is a ridiculous idea now when you think about it.
Well, and they were calling themselves a computer. They're saying it's a computer.
Exactly.
Well, I don't think it's ridiculous because in some ways it sort of replaced what a lot of people do or have done on PCs.
Well, ridiculous in the sense that if you think about what a PC provides, what wider things a PC does for people, outside of obviously playing games, it's, PlayStation never replaced a majority of that stuff. But it's crazy to think that it started like that, and then Sony almost took it in the entertainment direction with the DVD player and the Blu-ray player. So, and that their market, that's where Sony always played.
But can I just sit in that space for a little bit longer, Swinny? Because I think it's amazing how almost our video game landscape is the result of pissing contests.
Yeah.
So, and we spoke about it the other week, and I was actually thinking about it during the week, the Nintendo PlayStation. Like, I still, more I thought about it, I'm like, the Nintendo PlayStation is the most important, so far, the most important video game artifact that exists. Because it spurned on this company to create the PlayStation, which is now the dominant gaming platform, for consoles. Obviously, Steam would be globally, out of anything, or actually mobile games would be the biggest. But yeah, so you've got this company, and really it was a betrayal that that Nintendo betrayed Sony. They'd spent all this time in R&D to develop the CD drive, and then they didn't realize that Nintendo was also doing it with another company. Can you remember what it was? Was it Panasonic, or I can't remember what the other company was?
Yeah,
NEC or...
It
was one of the other major Japanese.
I always think it's Panasonic because I think they continue to work. No, was it Philips? CDI was Philips, wasn't it?
Maybe it might have been Philips.
Yeah, it was Philips because they also gave the properties to make those horrible CDI.
Yeah, Philips is not a Japanese company, though, right?
No, I think it is. Anyway, Sony being betrayed. Do you want to check it, Mike?
I'll check it.
So Sony being betrayed then spurned them to say, you know what, we're going to get into this and make our own thing, which then became super successful. Successful from the first PlayStation. And then the fact that they went too far with the PlayStation 2, sort of saying, hey, this is going to be a computer. We're going to have 4 or 5 PlayStations in every home. We won't need a desktop anymore. Then spurred Microsoft. And it did seem like it was a big component of them doing it. It was really, saying to people like Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, they want to make a computer. They want to be the computer. What are we doing with Sony? And maybe without those statements, they would never have made the Xbox, which is kind of crazy to think about.
It's wild, and it's really interesting because they talk about the Valentine's Day massacre meeting that they mentioned, which is sounds like one of the craziest executive meetings ever, and how pivotal it was in how the Xbox actually ended up going ahead. But the fact that the numbers and they lost so much money at the start, the Xbox console was not a money making machine; it was a money losing machine. It was a money losing machine.
It's a money making losing machine. Wait, what did you say? It's a money losing making machine.
Money losing making machine.
But the idea is that they're like, no, we need to we're still going to do this. It's wild. I just that whole thing about the fact that Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer were taking turns to just absolutely just destroy them verbally and stuff. It's wild.
But they got on board, according to the article, pretty strongly after a bit. They were quite supportive of it. So they obviously saw the the potential. But I think the part, it was definitely the part where they were in the meeting, and I think everyone was pretty negative about it, and they were about to shut it down, and then someone said, "What about the PlayStation?" And then everyone kind of said it, and that turned things around. Everyone's like, "Oh yeah, shit! What about the PlayStation?" So Philips is actually from the Netherlands. They're a Dutch
okay. So
company.
I'm not sure. Maybe it was Philips. Maybe it wasn't.
Maybe it wasn't. Who knows? Maybe it could have been Panasonic. Yeah, who knows? Just a quick point before we talk about the rest of it. I don't know what the numbers are when it comes to consoles, but given the number of PCs that I've built, I still find it quite fascinating that you can make this consumer product at that price point.
Oh yeah.
So the Xbox One X, the Xbox Series X being priced at $750 Australian. How much is it in the US? 500?
$499.
Yeah. Trying to build an equivalent PC, good luck. It's going to cost you at least twice that, probably. Yeah. It's actually crazy, like the kind of value you get in that sense.
Yeah.
So
the craziest was the PS3, because they were legitimately losing, like they were saying maybe $400 per PS3.
That's insane, yeah.
And the architecture of the PS3, even today, is pretty wild with the cell architecture. And, it was so much so that like genuine labs in America were buying PS3s in bulk, because what they'd figured out was you could run Linux on it. And then also the computational power you got from it per dollar was like leagues above anything else out there. So universities, some universities, like 1,000 PS3s in a grid to do computations.
They were the original scalpers. And
yeah, exactly.
Stupid universities.
Could you imagine
money-making machines?
A frat house like breaking into the server thing and being like, oh man, we can now like do. I know there's no system link in PS3. I don't think. If it's like, oh my god, we can like do like play bloody Call of Duty on all these.
Hello, bro. Oh shit, it's PS3. It sucks, bro.
But there's 1,000 of them.
Talking about system link, I just wanted to jump into the Bungie stuff. So, there's so many parts of this article, and what I really loved about this article, whereas it felt like if that thing didn't happen, the Xbox wouldn't exist today. And I feel like the whole Bungie being in a bit of a financial trouble or turmoil, which, pretty much happens with all these studios, even studios that we say, wow, they made a lot of big games, like Double Fine was in a lot of trouble before Microsoft bought them. And it looked like they were going to go under at one point. And you look at Bungie and all the stuff around Halo, and they didn't have high expectations of Halo. Like even, what's his name? Aaron Greenberg, who's the current head of marketing. Back then, he used to project how many sales for each game would occur. He had Halo way down the chart. I look back and I go, to me, Xbox was Halo at the start, and it isn't now. It certainly isn't.
Synonymous with it, yeah.
Game Pass to me is Xbox now. But like that's a different discussion. But certainly Xbox and Xbox 360, the differentiator for me was always Halo, personally. Like I felt like, well, that machine's got Halo, and that looks like a pretty decent FPS for a console. And I just look at it and I go, wow, if that Bungie acquisition didn't occur, would it really have survived, or would it have just been a one console sort of thing before it went on? So
it's pretty crazy because it did have some big hitters that, while you wouldn't think of as a big hitter now, at the time was like Dead or Alive 3 was huge. And they do talk to Itagaki. And it's really interesting because you think Splinter Cell, you think Dead or Alive, and obviously Bungie and Morrowind. These are the big games that were like, okay, these are the killer apps on the Xbox. And they have commentary from all of them. It's so cool. But one of my favorite things is actually when they talk about all the potential acquisitions. So they talked to a whole bunch of people. They got laughed down by EA. Nintendo, that's a funny one. The comment there, basically, that, like, what is it?
For an hour.
They just laughed their asses off. Like, imagine an hour of someone just laughing at you. It's great. But the craziest one for me is actually Midway. So Midway was... We know Midway doesn't exist anymore. And just think about how different things would have been, really, if they had purchased Midway, because they were a really big name in development at the time, and now like people don't really think about Midway, but like back then, like they were really big, and it's just interesting to see. We talked before about like was it sliding doors, like what would have happened with the what if scenario if they had actually purchased Midway, what would have changed there? And it's just because like even Square, I don't think they like that wouldn't have made sense to me at the time, but yeah, it was just really really cool. It's just one of my favorite things.
Yeah, like with the Midway one though, like that was one where I did understand from a business point of view, it doesn't make a lot of sense because the publishing and marketing and that was all like worth a lot of money back then, but it was basically zero for Microsoft. So
they didn't need it, yeah.
Yeah, they're going to be paying a lot of money for nothing. So it was just an unfortunate thing. I think what you'd maybe see now is they'd actually split the company up into pieces and sell the IP portion to Microsoft. So you get the the development chops and the Mortal Kombats and things like that across to Microsoft, and then retain the rest of the company and make a lot of money that way, maybe. And I guess they could have done that back then.
Then what are you left with? Yeah,
no, but there's still a lot of value in the publishing and the marketing and all the other work that they did as well. But Square, I don't know. I think Square still to me was like, maybe that was worthwhile to push that harder, because Square had such an interesting decade, right? Like from Final Fantasy VI on the Super Nintendo, then 7 switching over to PlayStation, big thing in Japan. Then, to this, where they could have been bought out, and then Square Enix. It's just, what a crazy 10 years that Square had in that period of time.
Yeah, it was wild.
So who was the actual console ultimately marketed at in terms of... So when you think about the fact that the biggest game really that they had was Halo, which they
didn't think it was going to be.
Did they not? Here's the thing.
No,
so
when
you
didn't.
think about...
They even said in this article that their numbers, they had it like way low on the list.
So when you look at the marketing that they had and I hope I'm not jumping in here, Swinny, talking about the fact that they used The Rock on the initial
this is
launch.
all free-form discussion.
I found it fascinating because, I remember I forget who the marketing person was. They looked at some studies that were being done and how wrestling was a huge thing. And obviously, there was a link to the target market that they had if they specifically chose The Rock and the whole wrestling theme.
So I'll just clarify. It was Cindy Spodek-Dickey, who was the manager of National Timber Promotions, and they found there was a crossover lifestyle report that essentially showed that fast food, the games crossed over with fast food and WWE. So
it's interesting, I think, because to me that by that point they obviously had.
It is true. This is the thing I love.
It is true.
It's true.
But I mean, they obviously had a target market in place at that point, because initially, the thoughts were we want to get a computer in everyone's room, but then you could clearly see they pivoted to a particular target market to try to make this thing successful. And I think if that was the case, a game like Halo makes perfect sense for it to be successful, because if your target market is people who are into wrestling, into more of those sort of action things, you can see why Halo would be successful within that context. So I'm surprised that they would have said, we don't think it's going to be successful, but at the same time try to market this console to the people that would actually be into those kind of games.
Well, that's because other than GoldenEye, a first-person shooter, and maybe Turok in a very lower end of it, a first-person shooter had never really proven successful on console. So
yeah, and there was a quote in the actual, I forget which do you guys remember who said that? That it's like it was the number one thing you don't do, which is
it's like a rule of nature.
First person shooter. Yeah, it was like a rule of nature. That was it. Yeah.
Yeah. But the whole rock thing, like that was awesome, and it's such an iconic, I guess, visual of Bill Gates and the Rock on stage of the Xbox.
That's brilliant.
That it's just like that.
It's like the nerd and the jock kind of.
We kind of, we put these stories up as clips on YouTube, but we kind of prepare some of the thumbnails and stuff, and I'm like, there's nothing else I'm putting up other than that. That has to be the thumbnail.
So I always check. This is
cool.
this is looking behind the curtains. I always check and go through the videos and go, I'm going to change this video out and do this stuff, which is pretty rare these days. But I actually went into this story and I was like, okay, the video has to be Bill Gates and The Rock, and if it's not, I'm just going to change it unilaterally. And then when I check the clip that you put in, I'm like, yeah, you've chosen the right clip. Sweetie. and the thing is that's cool is even today in 2021, Bill Gates and The Rock are almost as relevant as they were back then.
It's wild. It's wild.
For different ways in some ways, but yeah.
And if they'd chosen any other wrestler, like Stone Cold, maybe on the same level, maybe a bit bigger than The Rock back then. I don't know. You know that better than I do, Swinny. It wouldn't have been as good.
Yes, but The Rock was at this height of popularity that then we know what happened with The Rock. Like he became one of the biggest stars in the world. But I'm saying at the time, you're
making that decision.
But even at the time,
was
wasn't The Rock more... I know very little about wrestling, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like The Rock was the most fun kind of personality in wrestling.
He was the next big thing. And he was so they made the best.
He was also
possible.
available.
They made the best possible choice. That's all I can say.
100% they made the best.
That's
choice.
all.
But I wonder if he was the first choice. They didn't really fully go into that in the article, whether he was actually the first choice or he was the only one available at the time.
I don't think it's the
wonder.
latter. I think he would have been the people like.
He probably was one of the big choices. I'm not saying he wasn't, but I'm just curious.
No, because there's no as I said, Stone Cold, just Stone. You think about the characters of these wrestlers, which I know you guys aren't as familiar with. Doesn't make sense
at all.
It makes sense. The Rock, he was a corporate champion. He was the cool guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Made sense. It made sense.
Oh, and it's like the quote that you got in our notes, which is, do you think we need a couple of wrestlers on stage? And then someone said, we don't need a couple. We just need The Rock. So they were very clear, what they thought would make sense. And it's like what Swinny said. It was a perfect decision. The acquisition of Bungie, getting them on board, getting Halo as an exclusive, just, a few of these things put together then led them to outsell the GameCube, which actually surprised me when I checked that. It was almost the same, but it paled in comparison. So I think it was the Xbox launched 24 million, GameCube was 22 million sold, very decent numbers. And then the PS2, 155 million plus.
It's insane. It's insane.
And now, what I always say to people about that is, because they don't have the data for this. Even Sony doesn't have the data. But how many people bought a PlayStation 2 for the sole reason to use it as a DVD player?
Yeah.
Because
but I don't want to discredit the fact that a lot of people bought to play games on. But yeah.
Certainly not at launch. I bought it later down the track to use as a DVD player, but that was... once it was sort of in multiple iterations, the smaller version of it.
But
not originally.
People don't remember because, especially if you're younger, you just have no recollection of this, but because you didn't exist. Back then, in the early 2000s, DVDs were that was the way to watch things. Movies, even TV shows started coming out on DVD. And DVD players were expensive, but you could buy a PlayStation 2 in Australia and America for the same price as a DVD player. And a lot of people would argue it was better DVD player than others, dedicated DVD players.
Yeah, but I think when you started getting a lot more region-free DVD players, then it wasn't as,
That's true. In Australia.
And they became cheaper.
In Australia, that wasn't a big deal in America, because you got to remember, America, the world is America. There is no other world.
But I think it's also one of those things, why would you buy a standalone DVD player when... even if it costs you just a little bit more, you get a console that you can do so much more with.
So, for instance, my dad bought a PlayStation 2 and a PlayStation 3. He's not a gamer. He's never played a game in his life.
No, but Blu-ray was cheap.
Exactly.
They count
as sales.
Yeah,
so
it totally counts as sales, yeah.
I always kind of put a bit of an asterisk on those things. But, an asterisk, okay, give them 50 million. They still have 105 million sold for the PlayStation 2. Awesome article. The one thing that did shock me in the end, I really tried to figure out how many Halo copies were sold. And the number that I came to was 4.2 million. I feel like that's wrong. Because that leads to an attach rate of 17.5%.
No, somewhere in the article I thought it said 10 million copies of Halo sold, didn't it?
Oh, did it?
Or did I misread that? Wasn't there in
Okay,
the
that
article
makes more
someone
sense.
that said there was a number in there, Swinny?
I can't remember that one, but
I
You're the
do
fact
recall
checker.
that
I
when you
thought
said
somewhere
that.
it
Yeah,
said
when,
that.
when you say that, it does give me a flash that something like that had
Mm.
happened. Because that was the only thing that I thought, you'd think that it would sell like crazy, but yeah, great article. Was there anything else you guys wanted to mention from it?
so sorry, I'm just looking up. So I think you're right. It says by July 2006, 4.2. So, which
Yeah,
is
I
probably the
tried
same
to-
thing you found. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Also,
thing that
that's
people-
Wikipedia, and we know that sometimes that stuff is not accurate. But
Well, it's not that it's not accurate; it's that it's accurate to the information that's out there.
yeah.
Because some of this stuff they just never said. Like Microsoft
Yeah.
has never said, as of what was it, 3 or 4 years ago, how many Xbox Ones have been sold. So we're all guessing when people say, and people do know the number, but it's not public information, right?
I wonder if even if internally there, is there like a central, do the accounting team or who holds that sort of information? Because I know
100% they
the
do
places
know
that
that,
I've
yeah.
worked in the past, certain pieces of information like that just get lost. Like if I was to go back and say how many, people downloaded this particular app that I would have
Yeah.
worked on back in 2015, no one would know. That
Yeah.
information is not kept anywhere. Like it
Yeah.
was relevant at the time and then forgotten. It was on someone's drive. They left the company, never shared it with anyone else. Wasn't put in a central spot. It's gone.
Yeah. Look, I would be shocked if every single one of the big publishers didn't know pretty much.
They
down
would
the
have to, surely.
1,000.
Yeah. Yeah, surely.
They would know. But they just don't tell people. Now, really cool
Why
article.
would they? Yeah.
I'd love to see more articles like this. I echo Swinny's sentiment. I do think it's one of the
Yeah.
better articles I've ever
Oh,
read
it was
about
awesome.
video
Even though
games.
technically it wasn't an article, I still
Well,
think.
it's definitely an
I
article.
think
I
it
don't know why
was.
I say technically.
Well, look, it
it's
was
an
an
article.
it was an article, but the format was, and maybe that's what made it so good, because it was less about one person's personal writing and opinion per se, and more about just seeing what the actual people said. And I think that was super cool about it. It was just a huge collection of actual things people said. So
On to our next story, and I've been